I am an African.
I recently also saw a viral video of some sorry about that. I recently saw a viral video of some miners in Congo
I saw
literally
this.
saving. You
Yeah.
saw, yeah, where the mine was literally collapsing and they were saving each other from there. And so the question is, why are these groups, vilified? Because I think it's something that's seen as, wrong, but then, it's kind of odd because, these are people that are coming from those particular countries. They have the right to to collect, the resources themselves rather than a foreign entity.
Yeah, exactly. So why are they vilified? Which is a great question. And indeed, and yeah, that video, I saw that same video, and it was, it's a crazy video of
Yeah.
these miners just coming out of
I couldn't know the whole, yeah,
first time,
yeah,
and
yeah.
like just jumping out of the dust covered in. But so why are they vilified? I mean, I think the most important reason that comes to mind as to why they've been vilified in terms of economic policy and planning is this idea that artisanal and small scale African miners it's an unproductive, inefficient subsistence activity. And therefore, it's not of interest to economists as a poverty alleviation strategy, as a national development strategy. It's labor intensive. It's not using much capital or technology, and so it's not seen as an efficient development strategy economically. And so there's been a preference for instead, industrial mining, basically highly capital intensive, high levels of productivity is kind of the economic capitalist logic, I suppose. And so they were marginalized within this whole process of mining sector liberalization and privatization. And they were criminalized fundamentally because they didn't hold private property concession rights to the deposits that they had been working on. And so when you had transnational mining corporations coming in to take hold of those deposits, they had no formal claims to stay on that land. And so often, and this still takes place today, you have mass scale forced displacements of these miners, tens of thousands of miners at a time. Often police and military are leading these sweeps, as they're often talked about. And so these miners are being pushed out to the most marginal deposits, and taken off the most prized deposits, which are being taken control of by the corporations. So they were, but then they also become vilified in a sense because they're often associated with, rightly or wrongly, they're often associated with human rights violations or child labor problems, links to conflict financing, and so on. And these sorts of issues that, particularly liberal, Western liberals do like to focus on a lot. And so kind of get vilified for that reason as well. And then the end result is that they're basically, I think, a real misstep in which, these millions of African miners and workers across the continent are, sort of pushed out of kind of ownership and control of these resources in favor of foreign corporations predominantly. It is starting to change a little bit, and there are some shifts in some countries where things are starting to move back in another direction. But I do think this vilification is quite misguided and often misunderstands a lot of the developmental benefits and advantages that sector has to offer to local and national economies.
Yeah. That's very interesting because, and then it's fascinating that you actually wrote about it because even like when growing up, they are their names and nicknames for people who do that, and it's a derogatory term. So like in Zambia, and normally there's sort of the name is sort of coupled with gangsters and bandits and high level criminal organizations. So in Zambia, the term Jerabos. In South Africa, I think it's Zamas.
You had ninjas in Congo.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's never a good thing when really they are the only, like people would talk about how, if you, older generations of Zambians would be like, would say that when they were growing up, they were called the copper spoon children. In Botswana, they called the diamond babies. But when it comes to, the average experience of people from these countries, it's very unlikely that they have actually seen a diamond mine. They most likely don't have shares in any diamonds or anything. So these guys are basically at the forefront of these things, even though, it's quite rude and the way they're doing it. But I think one thing that's also interesting after privatization is the incoming of multiple actors, international actors. So, people talk about the new scramble of Africa. Our first episode was actually on the new scramble of Africa. And so we see not only the traditional, the UK, the former colonizers and the Anglo-American companies and conglomerates. We also see China, we see India, we see the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all of these countries coming in and getting shares and majority shares. I think in China, in the DRC, I read somewhere that almost 70%, there's what is it called? A monopsony and a monopoly. China was almost becoming a monopsony and a monopoly, which basically means you control the production and you also control you are the market as well, the dominant market. So most of the mines are owned by China and the client was China. So if you could just speak about that and sort of this massive influx of international players in the mineral industry in Africa. Even in Ghana, there were protests against Chinese multinationals coming in oil fields and so on and so forth. So could you just speak about that? And is there anything Africa can do to benefit from it? Because normally people talk about how, as just a pawn and so on and so forth. Listening, we also have an episode in China as well. You could check that out as well if you want to know more about Africa and China.
Yeah, well, is there anything that Africa... I mean, you're right. This huge amount of interest in what have been called critical minerals and metals that are needed to drive the kind of hoped for transition to low carbon economies in society globally, which are, littered across the continent in abundance. And so you have increasing attention from, all sides of the globe centered on Africa's minerals. Yeah, on the one hand, that, should play to governments' benefits in terms of being able to leverage and negotiate contracts for their products if they have more people interested in them than one, for example. But in terms of, and there's also a lot of excitement about the potential for this to deliver development, right, to Africa. This is sort of the big thing that people have excited, kind of a lot of development corporations and agencies and so on are very sort of focused on is, how can African governments and countries leverage this supposed opportunity to achieve national development aspirations. And so that, of course, there's always opportunity, and there's always, we should never completely write off or foreclose, right, what's possible and what can happen. But I think, at least my own perspective on it would be, if you look at the African Union, AU 2063, what is one of their defining aspirations? It's essentially, it's for African countries by 2063 to have structurally transformed away from a dependence on exporting primary commodities and minerals and metals, and to have created, full and productive employment for all, and to be prosperous, right? And to take its place within the global economy. And so if that is your aspiration 50 years from now, and you look at many countries, I'm sure it's similar in Ghana, it is the case in Congo, their national development strategies are basically aimed towards that. They want to become middle income countries or low middle income, high income, right? That's what they're looking for. And so that is what you're looking for, and that's what you want to achieve. I think fundamentally you have to get serious about industrial policy. As one of my mentors said to me once, if you don't have a serious industrial policy, I think all bets are off. If there's one common thread in the history of countries that have gone through processes of economic transformation, sustained processes over time, where they've diversified their economy and transformed them structurally away from that dependence on exports, the one commonality is those countries got serious at a certain point in time about having an industrial policy that was not just focused on following a comparative advantage in your minerals and metals. And so in terms of course, there's opportunities there. There's always, ways and means through which, despite the constraints, if you have the political will and you have the strategy and the policies, things can be achieved, right? And if you can get some of the fiscal revenue from the exports and put that in place and reinvest those in developing other sectors that are deemed to be strategic, yeah, absolutely, this can happen. But then, of course, the question is, well, how likely is that to happen in a country like Congo, which has just voted in, Tshisekedi for another 5-year term under the same political logics of Kabila? So there's like a real world question of, well, how likely is this to happen? And is it just going to benefit a very narrow kind of political elite in these countries, which I think is, sadly looking like the more likely scenario in a country like Congo? What is going on is in the Congo is that you have a very narrow political class that is benefiting from that interest that's coming in this new scramble for Africa. And then it's the political struggle in Congo, that's being led by, different Congolese movements and activists to try and shift that. Open question as to, how successful they will be and how much they can shift in what shorter time period. Because one of the things with these minerals and metals is obviously once they're gone, right? They're not coming back. And these mines are so much more productive today than they were in the 80s and 90s. And that's what's kind of frightening when you look at the speed at which they're extracting these minerals. Once they are gone, they are gone. So, but of course there are things, and I think you could also look to the 60s and 70s, as we were talking about earlier. Look to some of the policies that were pursued by governments at that time. Look to some of those lessons that can be learned from the past. But yeah, I think it can't just be done in kind of a trickle down way where you hope that exporting these minerals will then, drive all this transformational change and make Africa kind of prosperous continent by 2063 on its own. I think, there needs to be a serious engagement with industrial policy and how to use the benefits of those exports as a way to develop other sectors which are more relevant to the needs and interests of people on the continent, right? And that can also absorb more labor. Because these sectors, these mineral metal export sectors, they're so capital intensive. They're not, and as as we all know, one of the huge issues facing so many countries on the continent is unemployment. Thousands and thousands of graduates coming out every year from universities with nowhere to go. And so industrialization, to my mind, you can think about it as, how do you have urbanization without slums? Something else a mentor said to me at one time, right? How do you absorb productively? And the way to do that is not through just exporting minerals. You have to have some sort of way in which you're going to use some of that to develop these other sectors that are more relevant to your internal domestic economy, I think.